Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to ask Zajef Navia for her second rerun banner. It's very difficult for me to make up my mind on how good I think she is overall nowadays, because there were a lot of characters released since her last banner that slot into her teams and that slot into her teams well. So we've got a lot to talk about today. As usual for the Ask Zajef, I start by talking about overall place in the meta, pull value, and then I take questions directly from chat. So if you're interested in having one of your questions answered in one of these Ask Zajef videos, come follow me on Twitch. But yeah, let's just get right into it. What is Navia's current place in the meta? As is the case for every other pre-Natlan carry, Navia lost some value with time from overall carry power level going up. Yes, thank you, Risley Right Nut, for the message that perfectly encapsulates the sentiment. She's not Mavuika or Navia. And in the current landscape of Genshin characters and of teams, if you go out of your way to play your best available Navia team instead of your best available Mavuika team, if you have her, it'll be worse. Even with a blessing like this that gives you 75% skill damage, it'll be worse. But obviously, not everyone enjoys playing only the best teams. And when it comes to teams other than the number 1 and number 2 best teams, it's still nice to know how good they compare to one another. So how good is Navia overall? When you look at the highest actual Navia carry teams, they are fairly significantly behind the Mavuika teams, obviously. I think a good way to conceptualize Navia's strength is to realize that a character like Navia is balanced around the sheer amount of quality of life he has and ease of use. And Navia's teams don't even outdamage Navia's teams. The way I see it nowadays, there's like a few different, I guess, steps on your DPS ladder, where if you're above or below specific DPS breakpoints, it significantly changes how valuable I perceive you to be. The number 1 is the 3-unit Hyper Bloom. If your best team as a carry is worse than your best team using Nahida, Raiden, Singto, and not swapping into your unit is completely doomed. Then you have reasonable assumptions for non-perfect gameplay for a Hyper Bloom team, which will generally fall somewhere between 70 and 85k DPS at KQM standard investment. If your carries good teams hover around the 70k DPS mark, it's hard to justify going for them if you care about meta. And then the next step is Navilet's teams. If your carry's damage is below Navilet, they won't be worth going for in order to make your 2 best teams. But if they're sitting between Hyperbloom and Navilet, they're at least strong enough that if you don't like Mavuika, or if you don't like Navilet, you can consider that carry as your option for a second team. Or if you want to start getting ready for the leaked future endgame content with 3 teams, for a 3rd team. And Navia actually falls between Hyperbloom and Navia. So she fails the Navia check, but she does not fail the Hyperbloom check. And in my eyes, those sorts of carries are pretty healthy for the game. And they're the sort of carries where, if you like them, if you enjoy either their gameplay or their character enough to actually want to pull them, you will be able to make strong meta teams around them. They're not the carry you should go for if the main driving force behind your wish decisions is meta. But if you're someone who cares about meta, but also wants to pull for characters they like, the character is meta enough that you won't feel bad going for them. All that being said, what are those Navia teams that are the best? Right now, Navia's current best team is arguably Wheelchair. But it's not really Wheelchair, okay? The Xianyun and Yelan Furina core is often referred to as Wheelchair, but Xianyun is a much better support for Navia than she is for most carries. Because Navia is a burst-reliant unit, and Xianyun generates an insane amount of particles if you can afford to do 2 skills per rotation, which you can in Navia teams. And that leads to a situation where you have the units in Wheelchair, but your Navia is still doing pretty good damage. She's performing fairly well. Outside of that though, Navia also has a fairly good performance in teams that are focused mainly on her personal damage. So teams that use Bennett instead of Yelan, for example. If you're using Bennett, you can also start considering using Mavuika or Fairlane on the last slot, and it's pretty good. Depending on your level of investment, depending on which units you have available, which units you want on the other team, your Navia teams can end up changing a lot. And that's actually one of the nice things for Navia. If you just look at Navia in a vacuum, she uses popular supports that it's very possible that you'll end up wanting on your other team. But she has a few team options that don't necessarily use the same supports. One of those team options is Xianyun. The main reason why Xianyun is a viable option in Navia teams is because Navia's normal attacks are complete dog shit. It's something I talked about in her pre-release. I talked about how so much of her damage is concentrated in her skill that honestly the main purpose of her normal attacks is generating the crystallizes for your next skill. It does do a bit of damage, especially with the Ascension passive that gives you 40 damage % for it, but it's not an impressive amount. Using Xianyun allows you to do better on-field combos with your Navia because her plunge attacks are a lot better than her normal attacks. By default, if we count the crystallizes we're triggering from normal attacks, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There we go. So you'll end up only being able to generate 2 bullets from her normal attacks. With plunges, on the other hand, because the plunges don't have ICD, 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know why I was struggling to pick them up, but whatever. You get to trigger Crystallize on each plunge. But you basically change your Crystallize generation from 2 to 3 to 4. So it's an additional upside that you get from Xianyun past just directly the damage. But even if it wasn't for that, directly the damage is pretty significant, actually. With your burst, things can end up lining up in different ways, but the reality is that your burst will never line up consistently unless you're doing a sim that always gets their actions exactly with the same delay between them. Anyways, those things together effectively make it so that plunge is actually a viable option for Navia. And your last slot, generally you'll want a Geo character. And as painful as it is to say and think about, your best option here is Xianyun, even if you don't have her C2. Because even without the shred, Xianyun provides more than the other Geo characters because the other Geo characters are so ass. As it turns out, 40 damage % to Navia and 8 Geo particles plus either 3 or 6 Fav particles, depending on your Fav refine, is kind of just the best that you can do. I think Kachina's pretty close, but I'm honestly not sold on Kachina. She's so clunky to use, man. That being said though, your other Geo options are not far behind Xianyun. Effectively, what this means is pretty much no matter what your other carry is, it will be possible for you to make a good Navia team on the other side. The only situation where it becomes a bit more rough is if your other side carry wants both Xianyun and Furina, because the Navia teams that don't use Xianyun can't really use Mavuika very well. You end up with like Bennett channeling Chiori, Bennett channeling Kachina, Bennett channeling Zhongli, Bennett channeling Geo MC. And those are still good teams, but they're a bit worse, unfortunately. Xianyun was a pretty big and pretty impactful buff to Navia, mainly because of the sheer amount of energy that Xianyun provides compared to other buffers that can take the Geo slot. When you play Navia with Xianyun, always remember, if you're not doing 2 skills on Xianyun, you're not playing the team right. You'll get results worse than if you were using a different Geo unit. It's important for you to do 2 Xianyun skills per rotation, otherwise she's just not that great here. But if you do manage to do 2 E's per rotation, Navia's ER requirements are very, very low. Which actually means that both the Melusine Greatsword and Sacrificial Greatsword are significantly worse post-Xianyun release than they were previously. And I guess Coward Pride as well. Because if you have Xianyun, your ER requirements are outright just 0. And so weapons that give you ER lose a lot of value because that ER isn't helping you in any way whatsoever anymore. That's pretty much it for her overall place on the meta. Navia is a fairly decent character that isn't particularly outstanding, but has enough different teammates she can be used with that that it tends to be fairly easy for her not to have overlap with another one of your carries. Also, one thing I haven't mentioned earlier, when it comes to your last slot on your Navia teams, most of the time you end up with Navia plus 1 Geo, and then either double damage dealer or 1 buffer, 1 damage dealer. The damage dealer slot can be filled by Fischl. I guess one more thing that's relevant is her ability to front load damage on her first rotation because of her charge-based skill. Any character that has multiple charges on one of their relevant abilities has the option of cheating. What do I mean by cheating? If I use a character like Cutman that gets 1 uptime from her skill, and the skill has 1 charge and just lasts for an okay-ish amount of time, right? Once this kill is over, if the enemy has like 20% of their HP left, not much I can do. I gotta start my setup for the next rotation and wait out the cooldown. You won't be able to get any additional skill damage until 16 seconds after you've used your first skill. When you look at a character like Navia that has 2 charges on her skill on a 9-second cooldown, it effectively means that the cooldown for those 2 charges is 9 seconds each, so 18 seconds, right? But because it's split in 2, she gains the ability to do an additional skill at the end. She doesn't have to wait out the full 18 seconds. As long as there's been 9 seconds since the first skill, you can get 1 more. The problem with doing something like that when it comes to a longer chamber yeah, as you can see, if I do this, my skill cooldown isn't back, so I can't do a 3rd skill on the 2nd rotation as well. And usually, if you're doing perfect rotations, you'll get your skill every 3rd rotation in most teams. But because most people don't end up with perfect gameplay, your rotations end up being like 1 or 2 seconds longer, which is the 1 or 2 seconds you need to get it every other rotation instead of every 3rd rotation. Because your rotations are longer than 18 seconds in most of your Navia teams. There are some Navia teams that do 18-second rotations. I mean, specifically, the Mavuika team can do 18-second rotations, but all of this to say, Navia is one of the characters that gets more damage on her first rotation than she does on her 2nd rotation. The fact that she gets that 3rd skill sometimes, but namely, she gets it reliably on the 1st rotation, is a big deal for front-loading damage, which means that when it comes to content where you need to reach specific breakpoints, being able to front-load a bit more damage on your 1st rotation is pretty significant. It might be what you need to be able to finish off the enemy in the 1st rotation instead of needing to do an additional setup. Compared to other carries that pass the Hyper Bloom check but don't pass the Navia check, I'd say that Navia is arguably the easiest one to play. Right now, pre-Escoffier release, the carries that pass the Hyper Bloom check but not the Navia check are Navia, Kinich, Chaska, Hutao, Lenny, Gaming, Molani. Out of those, pretty much all of them, other than Navia and Chaska, are pretty hard to play. Chlorine does as well, actually, that's true. Outside of Navia, Chaska, and Chlorine, right, when you're looking at Kinich, in order to have him actually noticeably outperform the Hyperloom teams, you need to get 5e rotations, and that's hard. You look at Molani, I don't think I need to elaborate on Molani potential issues in actual gameplay. Gaming, same thing. Hutao has some mechanical execution that's a bit more difficult to do. But yeah, so if you're looking for a character like that isn't a pain in the ass to play, it's generally going to be between Navia, Chaska, and Chlorine. And because Chaska's performance in AoE scenarios is kind of god-awful, I'd say that it's mostly between Navia and Chlorine. But all in all, both in terms of her overall place on the meta and in terms of her pull value, Navia's a pretty reasonable unit. In any case, that's going to be it for the generic stuff So it is now time to start taking questions from chat. At Zajef77, how do you make sure you have Marechaussee uptime in her rotations? You don't. Realistically, even with like not exactly perfect Marechaussee, her DPS is still pretty decent. And assuming you're using her with Furina. But it can be a little bit annoying because when you don't get your crit on your skill, you notice it. And if you're building enough crit rate that you are at 100 crit with the fully stacked Marechaussee, it feels even worse. But most of the time, you won't really find yourself struggling with it too much. When it comes to Marechaussee versus her signature set, the fact that Mavuika has given her more non-Furina options pushes her signature a bit, but her best teams currently still do have Furina, and so as long as your Furina is available, and as long as you have Furina, obviously, if you already have a good Marechaussee, you don't need to go into her domain and farm for a new set. In her premium team, would you opt for Furina or Mavuika, or both and not Bennett? It's more both and not Bennett, honestly. I mean, it depends. It depends on investment level. Depends on whether or not you have cons on her, depends on whether or not you have Sig on her, depends on whether you have cons and or Sig on the other characters, depends on your Bennett constellation and what weapon he's using, depends on your overall artifact investment. There's just too many factors to give you a proper answer. All that being said, at KQM standard investment, excluding bullshit Bennett, Siglali, Mavuika stuff, the team that sims the highest is a slightly too optimized wheelchair, and the team that follows it is Furina Mavuika. Is Navia's performance very dependent on her specific Geo teammates, or can she get away with the 4-star Geo options because 5-star Geos aren't commonly owned? Well, Xianyun is pretty commonly owned, but I assume you're asking outside of Xianyun. Outside of Xianyun, yeah, the 5 stars and the 4 stars are pretty similar. Often the 4 stars can actually be better. Like, in my eyes, Kachina, Ning, and GOMC tend to be better options for Navia teams than non-C1 Chiori or Albedo. Only sometimes. Is Iansan good in Navia Plunge? Who does she replace? So, with Plunge teams, you don't want to ditch Furina, and you can't ditch Xianyun. So pretty much your only remaining ditchable slot is the second Geo. If your second Geo is Zhongli, which we'll use because he's more simple, right? What do you get out of Zhongli? You get 12% damage and 20% shred. Actually, it's 40% shred because you also have the Geo Resonance. And then another 25% damage from the Geo Resonance. So it's 37% damage and 40% shred. Iansan would be like, if she's C6, bit over 1,000 attack and 25 damage percent. Generally, the shred will be a bit better, but it's close. That being said, the additional Geo and the additional Crystallize that comes from Zhongli and or Xianyun and or Kachina and or whatever other Geo you're using helps you results a little bit more in favor of the double Geo stuff. What's her value for newer accounts? Question from YouTube post. I mean, it depends on what else you already have. One nice thing for Navia is that if you're a newer account, you have a C0 Bennett or a C1 Bennett, you have Kachina, you have C0 Xiangling. A team like this does pretty okay considering how easy it is to put together on a new account. And it's pretty easy to play. There's not that many carries where those two statements are true. A lot of the time, it's one of the two. With Molani, teams are easy to put together on a new account, but they are not easy to play. With Mavuika, she's easy to play, but the teams are not easy to put together on a new account. Which weapon as a free-to-play option? It depends on which teammates you're using. Unfortunately, there is no good Claymore stat stick that doesn't have any form of condition for free-to-play players. When you're looking at your Claymore stat stick options, you have Tidal Shadow, Earthshaker. Like, technically there's this too, but this isn't great. If you can activate the effect from Tidal Shadow reliably, it'll generally be her best free-to-play option because it's a lot of attack on the passive and the subside is useful, right? It's more attack than the Milazine Sword. Actually, no, it's the same amount of attack as a Milazine Sword, but the subside is actually useful. But if your healer is Bennett and you're not using Furina, you won't be able to trigger this, at least not reliably. Even if you are using Furina, you might not get this at the start of your first rotation because it takes a while for Furina to eat your HP enough to go below 70%. That being said, because of Xianyun, because Xianyun's burst isn't reliant on you being below a certain HP threshold, Tidal Shadow is a lot better than it used to be. Earthshaker is like okay when you don't have Xianyun or Furina, but it's pretty similar to the Melusine sword in terms of damage, because in those teams, generally, Navia's kill ends up being about half, maybe a little more, of her damage, like 60%. So it's the equivalent of 16 damage percent instead of 32. The Melusine Claymore gives you 48% attack, which is 20.4 more than this. So you're effectively trading 20% attack for 16 damage percent, which is pretty similar. But if you have the Melusine sword, you don't need to spend billets on this, considering they'll be fairly similar. But this one won't work in every team. Isn't Navia's best team now Furina, Escoffier, Yelan, Wheelchair? No. Escoffier, Yelan, Furina, Wheelchair is a very strong core that for a lot of carries is going to be better than Xianyun, Yelan, Furina. But in the case of Navia specifically, she gets a lot of value from Xianyun. When you're looking at a character like Hu Tao in a team like this, Xianyun is giving you the healing you need for Furina, and she's giving you Shred. But other than that, she's not doing anything for your Hu Tao damage. For Navia, you still have the Shred. You have an additional 20 Shred. You have an additional 25 damage percent from Resonance. You have an additional 8 Particles for Navia, which trivializes her ER requirements. And you have an additional Cinder City, because Hu Tao doesn't get Cinder City in this team. What's better for Navia's own damage between signature, cons, or support constellations? So it depends on what you're starting from, but it's going to be between weapon and support cons most likely, but not Xianyun and C2. Furina cons or Mavuika cons. Who would Navia main if she played Genshin Impact? Klein. What kind of question is that, man? That's going to be it for today. Overall, Navia is a character that I think of somewhat positively, but not impressively overall. If you like Navia, you can get pretty decent performance out of her. As usual, leave a like, comment, subscribe, do all the good old YouTube stuff. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.